There's a question people are often afraid to ask, not out loud, but deep inside. Why does it feel like this is not random? Why does the same problem keep repeating at the same time, around the same people, in the same patterns? You try to ignore it. You tell yourself it's coincidence. You tell yourself you're overthinking. You try to move on and stay positive. But something doesn't sit right because it's not just one situation, it's a pattern. Opportunities collapse at the last moment. Conversations shift without reason. Tension appears where there was once peace. And slowly, you begin to feel like there is intention behind it. Now listen carefully. I'm not here to make you suspicious of everyone. I'm here to show you something most people miss. Because when I was on the other side, we didn't rely on obvious attacks. We relied on patterns that looked natural, subtle shifts, repeated interruptions, small inconsistencies. Because if something looks normal, you won't question it. And if you don't question it, you won't respond to it. Now, this is where most people get it wrong. They look for dramatic signs, something obvious, something clear, but the real indicators are quiet, they repeat, and they follow a pattern. Now understand this clearly. It's not about guessing who, it's about recognizing what keeps repeating around you. Because once you see the pattern, you stop being confused, you stop ignoring what doesn't make sense, and you start responding differently. So today, I'm going to show you the shocking signs, not to create fear, but to bring clarity. Because once you can identify the pattern, you stop being caught off guard. And I, now this is the first sign. And this is where most people begin to notice something is off, but they ignore it. Patterns, not one situation, not one bad moment, but the same type of negative outcome repeating, especially around the same person. When I was on the other side, this was one of the most effective methods because a single event can be dismissed, but a pattern, if you don't recognize it, will continue. Now think about this carefully. Everything is fine, things are moving forward, then you interact with a certain person, and suddenly something shifts, plans fall through, miscommunication happens. You brush it off. You say, maybe it's just a coincidence. But then it happens again and again, not exactly the same, but similar. Now, this is the key. It's not the exact situation, it's the repeated outcome: delay, confusion, tension, disruption. Now, understand this clearly. Patterns don't lie because coincidence doesn't repeat with the same structure over and over again. Now, here's where most people go wrong. They focus on being polite. They don't want to assume anything. They ignore what they're noticing. And because of that, they stay in the same cycle. Now, here's the shift. You don't jump to conclusions, but you start observing without ignoring. You pay attention to timing. You notice what changes after interaction. You recognize what keeps repeating. Now, this is important. You're not reacting emotionally, you're becoming aware. Because awareness gives you control. Now, here's what happens when you do this correctly. You stop being surprised by the same outcomes. You start seeing patterns earlier. You begin to understand what triggers certain situations. Not perfectly, but clearly enough to respond differently. Now, this is the first sign. Repeated patterns that follow the same person. Now, in the next chapter, I'm going to show you the second sign, because sometimes it's not just patterns. It's how your focus and clarity change after certain interactions. And if you don't notice it, it affects your decisions without you realizing it. Now, this is the second sign, and this one is even more subtle because it doesn't show up as something external, it shows up inside you: confusion. But not just any confusion, confusion that appears right after you were clear. When I was on the other side, this was a key point of disruption: not to stop someone before they understood something, but to interfere after they gained clarity, because clarity leads to action, and action creates progress. So instead of blocking clarity, it was easier to distort it right after it appeared. Now look at how this shows up. You finally understand something, you make a decision, you feel sure about your next step, and then you talk to a certain person, or you enter a certain environment, and suddenly everything feels unclear again. You start questioning yourself. You second guess what you already decided. You feel unsure about something that was just clear. Now understand this clearly. Real clarity doesn't disappear without a reason. So when confusion shows up immediately after clarity, that's a pattern. Now here's where most people get it wrong. They assume the confusion is the truth. They think, maybe I was wrong before, maybe I need more time, maybe I shouldn't move yet. And just like that, they delay. Now this is how the pattern continues: clarity, gay interaction, confusion, a delay, again and again. Now here's the shift. You don't trust confusion that appears suddenly. You pause. You go back to your original clarity. You ask yourself, what did I know before this moment? Because most of the time, that first clarity was accurate. Now, this is important. You're not ignoring new information. You're recognizing when confusion is disrupting what was already clear. Now, here's what happens when you do this correctly. You stop second guessing everything. You trust your initial understanding more. You make decisions without unnecessary delay. And that changes everything. Now, this is the second sign: sudden confusion after clarity. Now, in the next chapter, I'm going to show you the third sign, because sometimes it's not about what you think, it's about what you feel after certain interactions. And if you don't recognize it, it can drain your energy without you even noticing why. Now, this is the third sign, and this is the one most people feel, but rarely understand, because it doesn't show up in your thoughts first. It shows up in your energy. You can be completely fine, focused, clear, motivated, and then, after interacting with a certain person, something shifts. You feel drained, heavy, unmotivated, not tired from work, but a different kind of tired, the kind that makes simple things feel harder. Now, when I was on the other side, this was one of the most effective ways to slow someone down, not by stopping them directly, but by reducing their energy. Because once your energy drops, everything becomes slower. You delay decisions, you lose focus, you stop acting. And just like that, progress slows down. Now, here's the key: this doesn't happen randomly when it repeats with the same person. One time, maybe coincidence, but consistently. That's a pattern. Now, here's where most people get it wrong. They ignore it. They say, maybe I'm just tired. Maybe it's just a long day. Maybe it's nothing. And because they keep ignoring it, they stay in the same cycle. Now, here's the shift: you start paying attention to how you feel before and after interactions. You notice the difference, not emotionally, but objectively. You ask yourself, how did I feel before this? How do I feel now? Now, this is important. You're not blaming, you're observing, because awareness gives you control. Now, here's what happens when you do this correctly. You stop ignoring the drain. You begin to protect your focus and energy. You adjust how and when you engage, not dramatically. Now, this is the third sign: unexplained energy drain after interaction. Now, in the next chapter, I'm going to show you how all three signs connect, because this is not about isolated moments. It's about recognizing a pattern that repeats in different ways. And once you see that pattern clearly, you stop being affected by it the same way again. Now, this is where everything comes together, because these signs are not random, they are not separate, they are part of one repeating pattern. When I was on the other side, this was the real structure, not one obvious sign, but multiple small indicators that, when combined, revealed the source. Because one sign can be ignored, two signs can be explained away. But when all three begin to appear together in the same sequence, it becomes clear. Now look at how this works. First, you notice repeated negative patterns around a certain person. Things don't go as planned, delays happen, situations shift unexpectedly. Then, after interaction, your clarity changes. Something that felt certain becomes confusing. You begin to question what you already understood. And then your energy drops. You feel drained, unmotivated, disconnected from what you were about to do. Now understand this clearly. This is not coincidence when it repeats in the same order. Pattern, confusion, drain, again and again. Now this is why most people stay stuck, because they look at each moment separately. They say, this situation was just bad. This confusion is just me thinking too much. This tiredness is just normal. But they never connect the sequence. And because they don't connect it, they don't see the pattern. Now here's the shift. You stop looking at isolated moments and you start looking at the sequence. What happened first? What changed after? What repeated again? Because patterns reveal what isolated moments hide. Now, this is important. You're not trying to accuse anyone. You're trying to understand what keeps repeating around you. Because once you understand the pattern, you stop being affected the same way. Now, here's what happens when you see it clearly. You are no longer surprised. You are no longer confused. You are no longer drained without understanding why, because you recognize it early. And once you recognize it early, you can respond differently. Now, this is the key. Awareness breaks the cycle, not by force, but by removing the confusion. Now, in the next chapter, I'm going to show you how to respond, because seeing the pattern is not enough. You need to know how to protect your focus, your clarity, and your energy so it doesn't keep repeating. And that's where most people lose control. Now, this is where most people get it wrong. They finally see the pattern, they recognize the signs, they understand what keeps repeating. But then they don't change how they respond. And because their response stays the same, the pattern continues. When I was on the other side, this was the one thing we depended on. Not that people wouldn't notice, but that they wouldn't adjust their behavior after noticing. They would still engage the same way. They would still share everything. They would still ignore the moments where things began to shift. And because of that, nothing changed. Now understand this clearly. Awareness without response keeps you in the same cycle. So this is where the real shift happens. Not in what you see, but in what you do next. Now, here's the first response. You reduce unnecessary exposure. You don't need to cut people off suddenly. You don't need to create conflict, but you become intentional. You limit how much time you spend. You become selective about what you share. You stop placing yourself in situations where the same pattern repeats. Now, this is important. You're not reacting emotionally, you're responding strategically. Now, here's the second response. You protect your clarity. When you notice confusion after interaction, you don't immediately accept it. You pause. You return to your original understanding. You give yourself space before making decisions, because clarity should not disappear that easily. Now, here's the third response. You restore your energy quickly. The moment you feel drained, you don't ignore it, you step away, you reset, you bring your focus back to yourself. Because the longer you stay in that drained state, the more it affects your actions. Now, here's the key. You don't wait for the full pattern to repeat. You respond at the first sign, at the first shift, at the first moment of confusion, at the first drop in energy, because early response prevents the full cycle. Now, here's what happens when you apply this consistently. You stop being affected the same way. You maintain your clarity longer. You protect your energy without effort, not perfectly, but effectively. Now, this is the shift. You move from reacting after everything happens to responding before it fully develops. And that changes everything. Now, in the next chapter, I'm going to show you how to stay consistent, because even if you respond correctly once, if you don't maintain it, the pattern will slowly try to return again. Now, this is the part most people don't expect, because after everything you've learned, after you recognize the signs, after you change your response, you would think the pattern is gone, but it's not. It tries to come back, not all at once, but slowly. When I was on the other side, this was the final strategy, not to keep someone unaware, but to wait until they became inconsistent, because consistency is what breaks patterns, and inconsistency is what rebuilds them. Now, look at how this happens. You become aware, you respond differently, you protect your focus and energy, and for a moment, everything feels better, clearer, lighter, more controlled. But then you relax, you think it's fine now. You stop paying close attention. You go back to engaging the same way as before. And slowly, the same signs begin to return. Not exactly the same at first, but similar. You notice small delays again. You feel slight confusion again. You experience minor energy drops again. And if you ignore those small signs, they grow. Until one day, you're back in the same cycle. Now understand this clearly. The pattern doesn't return suddenly, it rebuilds through small moments of inconsistency. Now here's the shift. You don't just respond once, you stay aware consistently, not in fear, not in suspicion, but in clarity. You keep observing patterns, you keep protecting your focus, you keep adjusting your response when needed. Now, this is important. You don't need to be perfect. You just need to not ignore the early signs. Because early awareness is easy to manage. Late awareness is harder to correct. Now, here's what happens when you stay consistent. You catch patterns before they fully form. You maintain your clarity without effort. You protect your energy naturally because it becomes part of how you operate. Now, this is the key. Consistency is not about doing something perfectly every time. It's about not returning to old habits without noticing. And once you reach that point, the pattern loses its control over you. Now, in the final chapter, I'm going to show you the last step, because once you stay consistent, there is one final decision that determines whether you fully break free or slowly fall back into the same cycle again. Now, everything comes down to this moment, not what you've heard, not what made sensey, but what you decide to do after this, because understanding patterns does not break them, seeing the signs does not stop them, only consistent action does. When I was on the other side, this was always the final point. People would recognize everything. They would see the repeated patterns. They would finally understand why things kept happening. And then they would go back to normal. They would ignore small signs again. They would engage the same way again. They would stop protecting their focus and energy. And slowly, everything returned. Now understand this clearly. You don't break a pattern once, you break it by refusing to return to it. That's the difference. Now here's your moment. Not tomorrow, not later, now. Because the next situation you face will test everything you just understood. You will see a familiar pattern. You will feel a familiar shift. You will notice the same signs trying to appear. And in that moment, you will have a choice to ignore it or to respond differently. Now, this is what real change looks like. You pause when something feels off. You protect your clarity when confusion appears. You step back when your energy drops. Immediately. Not after everything happens, but at the first sign. Now, this is important. You don't need a perfect plan. You don't need to control everything. You just need to stop repeating the same response. Because different response creates different outcome. Now, here's what happens if you act. You stop being caught in the same cycles. You maintain your clarity in situations that used to confuse you. You protect your energy without feeling drained. And over time, the pattern loses its influence. Now, here's what happens if you don't. Nothing changes. The same delays repeat. The same confusion returns. The same energy drain continues. And eventually, you stop expecting anything different. Now the choice is simple. You either continue the same cycle or you break it now. So don't ignore what you've seen. Don't go back to automatic responses. Don't delay your awareness. Act on it immediately. Because the moment you respond differently, you step out of the pattern. And that is where real freedom begins. Now, this is the part most people won't accept, but it's the truth. Even after everything you've seen, even after recognizing the signs, even after understanding the pattern, most people will still go back. Not because they didn't understand, but because they didn't stay aware long enough. When I was on the other side, this was the one thing we depended on the most. Not ignorance, not confusion, but forgetfulness. People would see clearly for a moment. They would feel the difference. They would say, "Now I understand." And then life would continue. Days would pass. Situations would come and go. And slowly, they would stop paying attention. They would stop observing patterns. They would stop protecting their clarity. They would stop guarding their energy. And without realizing it, they would fall back into the same cycle. Now understand this clearly. You don't lose awareness all at once. You lose it by slowly stopping to pay attention. One ignored sign, one overlooked pattern, one moment of "it's probably nothing." And that's how it begins again. Now, this is why most people stay stuck. not because the signs weren't clear, but because they stopped watching. Now here's the warning, not to make you fearful, but to keep you alert, because this will happen. There will be moments where everything feels normal again. There will be times where you think it's not that serious. There will be situations where you are tempted to ignore what you've learned. And in those moments, that's where the decision matters most. Now, here's the shift: you don't rely on memory, you build awareness into how you move daily. You stay observant, you stay intentional, you stay aware of patterns without becoming reactive, because awareness is not about fear, it's about clarity. Now, here's what happens when you maintain this: you catch things early, you respond before patterns grow, you protect your peace without effort, because it becomes natural. Now, this is the final truth. The difference between those who stay stuck and those who move forward is not knowledge, it's consistent awareness. So don't let this become something you heard once and forgot. Don't allow the same patterns to rebuild quietly. Stay aware, stay intentional, stay consistent. Because once awareness becomes part of you, you won't be controlled by what you don't see. And that is the difference most people never reach. Now, this is where everything changes. Because if you've followed every chapter, if you've paid attention to the signs, if you've understood the pattern, then this is no longer just information. This is your turning point. When I was on the other side, I watched this moment carefully, because this is where people either step forward or slip back. And the difference is always the same. Those who break the cycle decide differently at the moment of pressure, not when things are easy, not when everything feels clear, but when the pattern tries to return. Now imagine this: you notice the signs early, you feel the shift, you recognize the pattern beginning again. But instead of reacting automatically, you pause, you don't engage, you don't explain yourself, you don't ignore what you feel, you simply step back. That moment is powerful because that is where the cycle ends, not with force, but with a different decision. Now, here's what happens next: the pattern doesn't get its usual response, so it weakens. It tries to repeat itself. But something is different now. You are not responding the same way, and because of that, it loses control. Now, this is important. You don't need to prove anything to anyone. You don't need to confront every situation. You just need to break the automatic response, because that is what kept the cycle alive. Now, here's the shift: you move with awareness, you observe before reacting, you respond with intention, you protect your focus and energy consistently, and over time, everything changes. Not instantly, but gradually. You feel more in control, you think more clearly, you move with more confidence, because you're no longer reacting blindly. Now, this is the final truth: you are not powerless, you were just operating without awareness. But once you see clearly, you cannot go back to the same level of ignorance. Now, this is your moment, not just to listen, but to decide, to stay aware, to stay intentional, to stay consistent. Because every time you do, you weaken the pattern, and every time you break the cycle, you step closer to a different life, one where you are no longer controlled by repeated patterns, but guided by clear awareness. And that is where your real breakthrough begins. Now, this is the part people don't talk about enough, because breaking the cycle is one thing, but learning how to live after it is another. When you finally step out of that repeated pattern, there is a shift. At first, it feels unfamiliar. You might even question it, because for so long, you were used to the cycle, the patterns, the confusion, the repeated responses. That became normal. So when it's gone, silence feels different, clarity feels different, peace feels different. But that's not a bad thing. That's actually the beginning of stability. Now, here's what happens next. You become more aware of everything, not in a stressful way, but in a grounded way. You notice when something feels off, but you don't panic. You notice patterns starting again, but you don't get pulled into them. You remain steady, and that's the difference. Because now you are no longer reacting out of habit, you are responding from awareness. Now, here's the truth: freedom is not about never facing patterns again. It's about recognizing them faster than they can affect you. And that changes how you live. You move differently. You think differently. You respond differently. And because of that, the same things no longer have the same effect on you. Now, this is important. You don't need to constantly fight anything. You just need to stay aware and grounded in your response. That's it. Now, here's what most people experience at this stage: they begin to feel lighter. They begin to think more clearly. They begin to notice opportunities they couldn't see before, because their focus is no longer consumed by cycles. Now, this is the shift. Your energy becomes available again. Your clarity becomes stronger. Your decisions become sharper. And life starts to move differently. Not perfectly, but more intentionally. Now, this is your responsibility. Don't go back to old patterns. Don't ignore what you've learned. Don't relax your awareness to the point where you forget everything, because this new level requires consistency. But here's the good news: you're already capable of it. You've already seen the difference. Now you just need to maintain it. Stay aware, stay intentional, stay consistent. Because once you live this way long enough, the old cycle loses all power over you. And what replaces it is clarity, peace, and a level of control over your own responses that you never had before. And that is real freedom.